On November 9th, 2017, Eastland held their first Day of the Schools event. One of the 3 breakout sessions dealt with teaching and learning in a standards-based system. Teaching in a standards-based system has some differences compared to teaching in a traditional system. In a standards-based system, emphasis is placed on designing a course using the backward design process. What this means is that the teacher is identifying end-of-course expectations and then determining what needs to be taught and in what order for all students to reach those expectations. For example, say you are planning a family vacation. What would be the first thing you would need to figure out? If your answer was, "Where do I want to go?" that would be correct. Once you know where you want to go, the next step is to figure out how you're going to get there and what you're going to do while there. It is very similar in a standards-based system. Teachers need to determine what they want students to be able to do at the end of the course. And once those expectations have been established, the next step is to figure out and plan how to get as many students as possible to meet those expectations. If we break down the backward design model, the first step is to identify end-of-course standards or expectations. These expectations align to national, state, and locally created course standards. For example, the Illinois state standards are being used for all non-advanced placement math courses K-12. Here is one of the first grade math standards: to tell and write time in hours and half hours using analog and digital clocks. After standards have been identified, the next step is determining how the end-of-course expectations will be assessed. Teachers have been designing assessments that will be used to determine whether or not a student is able to demonstrate proficiency on a particular skill at the end of the course. When designing these end-of-course assessments, different levels of questions are used to help determine where a student's strengths or weaknesses are within a particular skill. The 3 levels of questioning determine whether students have a grasp of the basic knowledge needed, whether they can apply that knowledge to solve a problem, or if they can evaluate or create a product based on real-world scenarios. Once end-of-course assessments are created, teachers begin outlining how they're going to teach students a particular skill. Outlines will include units, the number of days within each unit, as well as the lessons that will be taught. Each lesson will be focused on one or more of the skills. As you can see in this outline, there are multiple formative assessments to monitor students' progression towards proficiency on a standard, and a final summative unit test that will assess each student's ability to demonstrate proficiency or mastery on that skill. The only grade that will be counted towards the student's overall course grade would be the summative assessment. The other formative tasks will be recorded and used to guide instruction and student learning. This way, students are not penalized for making mistakes during the learning process. It is important to note that assessments do not have to be traditional paper and pencil tests with short answer, multiple choice, or matching type questions. Formative assessments check for student understanding throughout the learning process. Formative assessments could be as simple as providing students with 3 cups, a green, yellow, and red cup, to show understanding of a skill. While working, students could put out the cup that shows how they are progressing with the skill being practiced. For example, if a student is confused or has a question, they could put out the yellow cup, while someone that is working fine would leave out the green cup. Formative assessments could also be in the form of traditional worksheets or homework, or IXL and Front Row. For those of you unfamiliar with IXL or Front Row, those are 2 web-based platforms that teachers use to practice skills. Summative assessments, which are done at the end of the unit, evaluate students' mastery of particular skills. These could be in the form of traditional tests, however, they can also be given in many other formats, such as portfolios, performance tasks, essays, oral presentations, or even one-on-one interviews with the teacher. Once a course outline is completed and the formative and summative assessments have been established, Teachers will begin planning individual lessons, focusing on each student's step that they must complete and be able to demonstrate before moving on to the next step. Each lesson will have identified outcome, a plan to get students to meet that outcome, and a reason why students are learning that skill. In addition to planning lessons, teachers must also reflect on how their lesson went. This should include, but is not limited to, what went well with the lesson. Did the students learn the skill or concept I was teaching, and how do I know? If a teacher does not have sufficient evidence to prove that students understand the skill being taught, they would need to reteach that lesson or do an extended practice to fulfill this need. This evidence could be as simple as a question at the end of the class period that checks for student understanding. So it is important to know that when we are using the term assessment, it is not always referring to a traditional test. The biggest difference between a standards-based approach to teaching and a traditional approach to teaching is that the teacher has the end-of-course expectations for his or her students at the beginning of the course, and that this teacher has developed lessons, activities, and assessments that are strictly aligned to getting students to meet these expectations. Teachers are focusing their lessons and diving more deeply into a skill in order to allow their students the opportunity to demonstrate mastery. Teachers are also allowing students multiple opportunities to demonstrate mastery of these skills. This will be discussed further in the next segment, how learning is different in a standards-based system. Learning in a standards-based system has a few differences compared to learning in the traditional system. Since end-of-course expectations are clearly established for each course at the beginning of the school year, students and parents are also made aware of the expectations. These end-of-course expectations are broken down and explained in student-friendly language. Here are 3 third-grade math standards. As you can see, the standards are written using domain-specific language. This language can be difficult to fully comprehend, so teachers will break down each standard for each student. For example, the first standard can be broken down into I can round whole numbers to the nearest 10 or 100. If the standard is put into I can statements, it helps the student understand what skill they are focusing on for that particular lesson or unit. As students are introduced to a new skill, for example, rounding whole numbers to the nearest 10 or 100, they will be provided multiple learning activities on which they can make and fix mistakes throughout an instructional unit. During this learning process, students' classwork, group work, and homework will be used as practice only. What this means is that they will not be graded on these learning activities. By not grading the learning process, students are free to take risks and make mistakes. It is important for students to understand that it's okay if they do not understand everything from the beginning, but that it is more important that they truly understand everything at the end. One common misconception is that if students are not being graded on the learning activities, that they will not do them. Students are still held accountable for doing the learning activities. If a student does not complete the activity, they will not be prepared for the summative assessment, and that will be reflected in their reported grade. Students will also be receiving feedback on learning activities. If the students do not complete these activities, they cannot receive the feedback to guide their learning. Feedback is a major component of standards-based learning. Feedback during the learning process will no longer be in letter grade format, but instead it will be in written text or verbal dialogue. For example, here is a third grade math problem to practice rounding whole numbers to the nearest 10 or 100. In blue is a student's response. Instead of a student receiving a letter grade on the practice problem, the teacher will provide that individualized feedback tailored to help the student reach their end-of-course expectation. As you can see, if a student just receives a B on the classwork, he or she may not know what they need to do to improve their answer. However, with the verbal or written feedback, the student knows what they need to do in order to improve their level of knowledge within that skill. Students will also be asked to reflect on their own learning progress to date. This reflection will vary from grade level to grade level or from course to course. For example, here's an Algebra 1 formative feedback chart. Students are asked to complete this feedback chart after they have received their quiz back from their instructor. In this chart, students will check whether they got each of the 9 question quiz questions right or wrong. For those questions that they got wrong, each student will analyze whether he or she made a simple mistake or if they really don't understand the question or what they did wrong. For those questions in which they made a simple mistake, they would correct that mistake and move on. However, for the questions in which they didn't really understand, they can get additional help from their instructor or peer. In this student's case, after completing the chart, they can see that they need additional instruction and practice with the skill of dividing fractions. This data also helps the instructor tailor instruction to meet the needs of each student. So instead of telling the student that he or she got a 4 out of 9, they will be able to determine with which skills they need additional support. The process of making mistakes, correcting mistakes, and demonstrating mastery of skills is a major component of learning in a standards-based system. Not only in the instances provided in the previous math examples, but also in high-stakes scenarios such as driver's license tests, ACT, SAT, bar exams, etc. All of these high-stakes scenarios allow for students, and even adults, multiple opportunities to demonstrate mastery. For example, if you fail your driver's test the first time, are you forced to ride public transportation for the rest of your life? No, you're allowed the opportunity to practice and study and then take the test again. And what happens when you pass the assessment the second time? Do you only get 50% credit? Can you only drive from 9 a.m. to 3 p.m. Monday through Friday? No, you receive your full driver's license. This works the same way in a standards-based system. Students are allowed multiple opportunities to demonstrate mastery of skills. Students, at the teacher's discretion, will be allowed to redo summative assessments. With each redo, students' most recent piece of evidence will replace the previous score. However, in order to redo an assessment, students must develop a learning plan that shows their teacher that they put in the work required to increase their proficiency on this skill before they are allowed to retake the assessment. This redo plan will vary between grade levels and teachers. The redo plan will become more sophisticated as students advance through school. There are still deadlines within units, and some of the learning activities are time-bound. There are indeed cutoff times for redos because the unit or grading period has been completed. As learning dives more deeply into skills, topics, and concepts, students will be able to apply, analyze, synthesize, and evaluate how these skills, topics, and concepts are connected to the real world. Students will be reflecting on their thought processes, making sense of complex ideas, skills, or topics. The biggest differences between a standards-based approach to learning and a traditional approach to learning is that the learner knows what they are striving for at the end of the course. The students are allowed multiple opportunities to demonstrate mastery over these end-of-course skills, which places emphasis on the learning that is taking place, not the grade at that particular moment in time. In a standards-based system, students will reflect on their own learning and work alongside their peers and teachers to reach the end-of-course expectations. In conclusion, standards-based teaching and learning has a few distinct differences from the traditional teaching and learning model. It is within a standards-based grading model that children are given the opportunity to flourish in a system that embraces the growth mindset with clearly defined outcomes, which allows teachers the ability to clearly communicate students' level of mastery of the course's standards or skills. Thank you for listening to the Teaching and Learning in a Standards-Based Grading System breakout session.